So instruction in mathematics has changed greatly with the implementation of the Common Core curriculum, and fractions is one of the areas where concepts are taught differently than they were in the past. So one of the problems we run into is that students who haven't had years and years of Common Core curriculum get stumped somewhere in 5th or 6th grade with something like multiplying fractions on a number line. But you can see if you look at particular concepts over time, for instance beginning in 3rd grade, that by the time students have had the curriculum for several years, a problem like you saw this evening would be no problem. For example, in 3rd grade, students are asked to do things like identify part of a whole using a picture, like the one you see here. So if we were to shade a particular part of it, they would be able to name that fraction as 1/2. And similarly, if they were asked to identify part of a set, they would be able here to figure that half of the circles are shaded, and so 1/2 of the set is what we're looking for. Also in 3rd grade, and this is new to Common Core, we introduce fractions on a number line. So students know that between 0 and 1 there are some parts less than a whole, and they're able to identify, for example, that the line right down the middle also represents 1/2. So even in the early stages of instructing fractions, students are able to name fractions in at least 3 different ways. Then we find in the 4th grade that concepts build upon what was taught in 3rd grade, and that using similar diagrams and number lines, they're able to just build further knowledge with fractions. So one skill in 4th grade that becomes really important is finding equivalent fractions. Let's say we had the same part shaded of the circle. So students would be asked to find that that is, again, 1/2. Or, in this case, 4 out of a total 8 parts. And so without knowing the traditional algorithm of multiplying numerator and denominator by the same number, they're able to name equivalent fractions. And then again, when we're looking at parts of a set, the students might recognize that half of the circles are shaded, and they would also be able to count to see that 4 of a total 8 are shaded. And so yet another way that they can identify equivalent fractions. Again, without the traditional algorithm being introduced. Using a number line, which is pretty new to all of us in instructing fractions, we could build on the one they saw in 3rd grade, so they know that this midpoint represents 1/2. And by stacking number lines and breaking them up into smaller pieces, they would also recognize that 1/2 could also be written as 4 out of 8 total parts. So you can see how what they've learned in 3rd grade helps them to move into what will be taught in the 4th grade. By the time students get to 5th grade, they're asked to do things like multiply and divide fractions, and they're often required to do it in multiple forms. We still teach the traditional algorithm, so if I ask them to find 1/4 times 1/2, they would be taught eventually to multiply the numerators and multiply the denominators to get the correct answer. But in Common Core, that's not enough. So students need to be able to show this, again, at least 3 different ways. To show them a problem like this, over here on our circle, we would tell them that they're really finding 1/4 of 1/2. So we would start by finding our half, and then ask students to take 1/4 of that 1/2. And on a diagram, that's easy to do. And then they could explain that that's really one piece of a total 8. Similarly, over in this parts of a set picture, we would ask them to take 1/4 of 1/2. Half the circles here are shaded, and to take 1 out of those 4, they would indicate by drawing that that's 1 out of a total 8 pieces. Perhaps what's most difficult, but becomes really second nature to students, is to multiply on the number line. So again, taking 1/4 of 1/2, they would know first to take their whole number line and divide in half. And when they do that, they're looking at this section of the line, and then taking 1/4 of that, they would simply shade or somehow highlight one piece, which again they can look to see is really one of a total 8 sections. So building on the concepts that they start early on in the 2nd or 3rd grade, by the time they get to 5th grade, working with a problem like this on a number line, becomes a piece of cake.